Hello everyone, welcome to Diversifying Data's first episode of 2024, brought to you by your host, as always, Raki Sharma. My pronouns are she, her, and to describe myself for anyone listening and not necessarily watching, I am an Indian woman with medium-length brown hair. I don't think I need to go into height because myself and my guest are sitting down today, but I'm really happy to be back on the podcast. So, it's been 2 years since we launched this podcast, and we are so proud of what we've achieved, the stories we've been able to share, and the messages that we've really been able to get out there in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we've had to beat some time to reflect, and after 2 years worth of episodes under our belt, we wanted to take some time out at the start of this year, not only to celebrate on what we've achieved so far, but actually to think about what makes sense in the next iteration of the podcast and how we're going to evolve, which is essentially what the world of data, cloud, AI, diversity, equity, inclusion, all of these things evolve with time, and we want the podcast to reflect that. So we have decided that we would like to link these episodes more closely to our industry and what's happening, the topics that affect us. So going forward, you're going to hear from us on hot topics and insights and the things in the news and how data and our industry is shaping the wider world around us. So we are going to keep telling powerful stories that engage and really inspire people, we're hoping. That's not going to change. But instead of anchoring the podcast around days of celebration or aligning it to a particular a calendar day of celebration like Pride or Black History Month, we are going to be expanding our reach and keeping the topics that we're going to be discussing with a clear focus on diversity and inclusion. So today's podcast is a really great example because we're talking about one of the hottest topics in the data industry right now, AI. So specifically around how bias shows up, the effect of that bias, especially on underrepresented groups, and what we could do, if anything, to counteract that. And I cannot do this alone. Today, I'm really, 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 really excited to be welcoming Mirela Gyurova, who is the Associate Principal at Kubrick. And Miri has such an interesting opinion and background and has done so much research around this topic that she's here to share with us today. So, Miri, I'm going to pass over to you to introduce yourself, but thank you for coming on the podcast.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you, first of all, having me to your podcast and for the great introduction. My name is Mirela. I go by Miri. And yes, I'm an associate principal consultant here as part of the training team. And I specialize in machine learning, data science, delivering technical training in those fields to our next-gen consultants. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white Bulgarian woman, 5'1", brown eyes, brown hair.
Fantastic. Well, I think to set the context of what we're going to be discussing today, because when we talk about hot topic, when we talk about the future of data, you cannot read anything without AI, generative AI, all of these things coming up. There's so much that we can dive into, but of course, centering around biases, diversity, equity, inclusion. How does that tie in to the really prevalent topic of discussion? I think that's something that we're going to break down. But I'd say genuinely human biases are making their way into artificial intelligence systems. That's pretty clear to see. And I think sometimes with harmful results, and I'm really keen to get into that a little bit more with you. So the ethical implications of AI, including fairness, trust, transparency, maintaining trust in AI is really crucial for ensuring widespread adoption. But the sort of secret, hidden nature of these systems really undermines trust, and I don't know if you agree with that statement from the offset.
Yeah, it's a black box, and it's an exceptionally complicated field, and definitely AI, especially generative AI and large language models, have been a buzzword recently, and all over social media. So definitely a very hot topic to discuss about, especially in relation to inclusivity and equity and diversion. I think that's a topic that's going to become even more and more prominent.
I agree.
In our daily lives.
I agree. And actually, I think the first thing to really note is everyone thinks that it's new. Everything about AI, generative AI, was all brand new. But really, it's not. We can look back all the way to 1988 as an example where the UK Commission for Racial Equality found a British medical school guilty of that discrimination, and the computer program it was using to determine which applicants would be invited for interviews was, determined to be biased against women and those with non-European names, which is incredible because you think that's something that we experience now. Algorithms determine who gets selected for a number of different things, whether it's interviews, whether it's project selection, etc. But the program had been developed to match human admission decisions. So it had been done with 90 to 95% of accuracy. So this is going all the way back to 1988. Broad brushstrokes. Have we learned from this? Have things really moved on?
We've learned there is an issue. I don't know how much we've learned in terms of how to tackle it. I think definitely there is a concern about bias around AI and discrimination, purely because there is compelling evidence about that. The recent examples in recent years have just been increasing, and they're quite shocking, and they capture so many different domains. Some are more talked about, others are less talked about. We can go into details, of a couple of examples that have been quite shocking. One that comes to my mind is an example from 2014, where Amazon, a team of software engineers, developed a machine learning tool, which was exactly trying to do that, to support the hiring process. So they built a tool which was aiming to review the resumes of job applicants. And because it was trained on past historical data, 10 years worth of data in the past, that obviously majority of it comes from male applicants, what essentially happened was the system taught itself how to penalize women applying for technical roles. Wow. So it would find male candidates to be preferable. And actually, to be even more precise, what the system would do is it would penalize CVs containing the word woman. So that's just one very kind of shocking example of discrimination that comes from biased AI.
And honestly, that's a great segue into us deep diving. But you think a company like Amazon, all the money in the world behind it, all the power and the influence, and it's a business worth billions. It's a business that touches most people, whether it's deliveries, products, and in the employee base is so wide that, to me, as recent as 2014, that is very shocking. It's not a niche company or a company, for example, like you read about in financial institutions or within the field of law that do have those historic biases and preferences towards men rather than women. That's actually quite shocking to hear that it was that recent. But
it took them a year actually to identify that bias. So you can imagine if you didn't have that deep pockets of resources and time to pour into diagnostics around the AI, it took a year.
I mean, not to start off on a somber note, because there are definitely, especially in terms of, obviously there are negative sides to AI, but there's also plenty of positives, and there's also plenty of growth and development and exciting innovations happening within the field of AI. But I think I'd really like to deep dive into why are we saying that there's a concern with AI and bias in terms of, is it rampant? Is it widespread? Are there sporadic examples? Because I know you mentioned the Amazon one, but I'd love to kind of hear from your perspective and the research that you've conducted. How are some of the varying ways that bias within AI is showing up?
Yeah. They're not sporadic examples. I think that the number of examples has been increasing exponentially, and just, some of them are getting the deserved popularity, others are not. Of course, different examples are of different severity. The issue, however, is that talking about them it's not nearly enough. So we need to start talking about those examples. Amazon is obviously one of those examples where, a hiring process was biased. Another example that comes to my mind is an analysis that Bloomberg conducted recently using a generative AI tool called Stable Diffusion AI. That type of a tool, it essentially generates photorealistic images based on text prompts. So what Bloomberg did as an experiment was to generate more than 5,000 images of what people would look like if they're associated with a high-paying role. And the analysis was actually quite compelling because, to no surprise, I guess, the majority of the images were predominantly featured light-skinned male individuals. And they did a classification of those images, those 5,000 generated images based on gender. And what turned out to happen was for every image that would contain or feature a perceived woman for a highly paid role, the same tool for the same occupation would generate more than 3 images of a perceived man. And that trend was pretty much kept across all occupations, apart from low-paid one. So when they asked, can you generate images of a housekeeper, of a cashier, it would be women. And actually, the most shocking thing, and I can't allow myself to kind of quote it by memory, is the title of that article, because I think it's really worth reading about it. So I'll read it. So the title of the article that Bloomberg posted. The world, according to Stable Diffusion AI, that's the name of the Gen AI they used, is run by white male CEOs. Women are rarely doctors, lawyers, or judges. Men with dark skin commit crimes, whilst women with dark skin flip burgers.
Wow.
I don't know. If anyone could remain impartial after hearing such a title.
And for Bloomberg as well, again, this is what's the most shocking. You think companies that have influence, power, finances to be able to, if they're going to go down a particular route, I know there's still so much undiscovered approaches on how to use AI. Everyone wants to use AI and harness the power of AI in their day-to-day lives and their jobs. ChatGPT is basically taking over everything as we know it. But it really shocks me the types of companies that you're referencing. It really does, because you know that there are these biases that have always been there. They've been in a continuum. But you think that now there's more scrutiny around this. People would be more careful not to, to reference things like that in such a haphazard manner. It's incredible.
You would assume, absolutely. And I think that's one of my biggest issues, because we kind of think that by talking about those issues continually, we would increase the awareness and people will start acting out of good faith, which is clearly a conflict of interest, in my opinion, because we're talking about consequences here that are the direct result of persistent, continuous, systemic oversight, negligence of preventative measures. And preventative measures, I mean, the name suggests it's there to mitigate adversity, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily generating, profit. So I think that's where the conflict of interest comes, because everyone would say, yeah, absolutely, we need to build ethical AI and responsible AI.
Yeah.
But I'm not entirely sure that people would actually list that as a priority higher to their priority to make profits.
Absolutely. That's what it's such a shame, but it is really, no matter how, and I know there are businesses that really are making strides within ethics, diversity, inclusion, but it's always undercut by that need for the business to make profits. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Honestly, I think there are strides that can be taken to make sure that the positive strides we're making within diversity, equity, inclusion match up to generating profits. I don't think that one has to suffer for the other to thrive. But I mean, just the other day, if we're talking about particular examples around biases, facial recognition software, you start there. I remember a study that I'd read on, I think it was Heathrow Airport, when they first did the biometric scans. They skewed it towards recognizing white male faces. And so 5-foot Indian woman such as myself, I had to go until they revamped it and took the feedback. You had to go to the kiosk and get your passport read and another example, hand dryers and hand, when you have to do put your hand in front of things, and these aren't things that I became acutely aware of until studies around this had been made, published and made, brought to light. And that's why I think it's just such an important topic. It's scary. Honestly, for me, I look to you to really provide your insight, because you've got a data science background. You know, you're an associate principal within this particular field. But the amount of conflicting studies and books that I've read on the positive elements, the negative elements, the real racial biases that exist, and it's really hard to reprogram. I would like your take on, like, I guess from the examples that we're seeing, and they're all recent examples, how hard do you think it's going to be to get us to a point where we can say that we trust the algorithms and we trust AI? Yeah. Especially when it comes to biases.
First of all, why are we doing so badly? I think it's very important to mention, just to manage, you know, the audience's expectation. I think it's imperative to mention that the field of AI is unmatched and incomparable to other fields that we've witnessed any advancement in. I think that the advancement in AI is outpacing the timeline of pretty much any scientific breakthrough we've seen in the past. I think it's going to have a greater impact on the world than, let's say, the Industrial Revolution, even if you will. Why am I saying that? The reason why we're so bad at managing that is because AI is improving at a pace greater than the pace of our comprehension. So how do you regulate and how do you control something that is moving faster than your pace of processing the information and reflecting and reacting to it? Of course, there are a lot of things which we can do to move that needle in the right direction, but I think it would be very arrogant of us to say confidently that we can have it under control.
I agree.
And
it's sorry, I took a moment to process that, because it is really scary when you hear that. It is. And I think obviously with us being, well, with Kubrick being a data, cloud, AI, next generation technology consultancy, what our aim is obviously to keep up with the exponential growth within this particular industry, keep up to date with the latest technologies that are emerging within different markets. AI, I know, has been a hot topic of discussion, not only, you know, in the wider sphere, but within our own internal business. How difficult do you think it's going to be to not only train this, but enable future data leaders to be adept in how to handle this?
Yeah, I think there is a massive push to adapt immediately to every new change within the data and tech and the AI environment, because literally every day there is a new tool and a new software out there, and we feel that pressure to, you know, become competent in using those things. And I think that leads to some sort of an analysis paralysis almost, when you feel like I can't keep up, right? And I think that we need to, sometimes the fastest way to get somewhere is to be kind of slow and just reevaluate the situation and step away from the details. And I think the most important thing we need to kind of hone on is those fundamental principles that we're trying to also hone and focus on during training, which is data literacy, data culture, awareness of AI and the risks it poses and how to use it and when to use it, because these are the main issues and the main concerns for me personally, because a lot of people they don't have any touch points with data and tech and the AI industry. I've heard a lot of people say that machines are neutral to human bias purely because they're not human. That's such a flawed logic. Machines are not neutral to human bias purely because technologies are either as good or as bad as the people that develop them. In fact, transferring human bias to machines is probably the easiest thing, which is done by just training them on biased data. So that's actually a phenomenon called algorithmic bias. When a machine learning model or an AI system, it perpetuates and it amplifies those already existing societal biases that are present within the data that the machine learning is trained on. So that's the first issue, right? It's the fact that people don't really understand that because it's a machine, that doesn't mean it won't be, susceptible to human traits such as human bias, which leads to an even wider issue, and I already mentioned that, which is the overarching lack of data and AI literacy around, across the wider population. Artificial intelligence is an exceptionally complicated field, and I believe I'll still be scratching the surface probably 10 years from now when it comes to it. And for someone to even remotely have rightfully the confidence to say that they know what AI is doing and how to deal and identify the risks and the pitfalls, you need to have some stellar level of knowledge and competence and experience in the field. My personal observation is that a lot of people are lacking that. Maybe we're underestimating. We're just getting excited. Oh, AI, it's gonna be able to help us
almost
clean,
like
or,
magic.
exactly.
Sometimes, that I agree with that.
Which is, it's quite concerning because that basically leads to people not knowing when and how and to what extent to use AI. Like the typical example is generative AI, right? Like everyone is talking about that. It's a buzzword. Oh, it's the salvation to every problem and every business. Generative AI is a type of artificial intelligence that tries to imitate human creativity, nothing more, just being creative. So it's great for stylistic polishing, for writing your drafts, writing your speech, code assistant. It sucks at maths. It sucks at maths. ChatGPT
That's the buzzword for generative AI. I love it.
Sucks at maths, and reasoning, and and if you go and ask ChatGPT questions like mathematical questions, can you prove square root of 2 is irrational, and it will give you the proof because someone has posted it, and it's a really well written and structured and formulated proof, and then you can just ask them, okay, can you prove square root of 4, which is 2, is irrational, and it would use the same logic, but it does it so fluently. So if you don't know maths, you'll be fooled by the fluency of the model. So that's an example of the lack of data literacy and how it can actually manipulate the person.
That's fantastic.
And then the worst, and a lot of people in my circle already know that because I've been bashing about it all the time. The biggest concern for me personally, which is a direct consequence of that lack of data literacy, is the act of monopolizing decision making. What I mean by that is more and more people will start trusting blindly that AI will think on their behalf and it will make the right decisions on their behalf, and they'll gradually forget how to critically assess and how to challenge the outputs. And here comes the catch. AI doesn't have a moral compass. So when it comes to diversity and equity and all of those fundamental philosophical pillars of our society, such as equal rights and equity, if we trust blindly AI to observe them, what we're risking losing is people losing the ability to autonomously exercise their right to think on their own, to formulate their own opinions, and then that will lead to our society as a whole losing its own sense to what D&I basically means. That's the biggest issue.
Oh, you phrased that so honestly. I was in absolute awe the whole time you were talking, because the way you framed it, it's very logical to think of it like that, but nobody does. I just see a greater reliance on it rather than an understanding of the benefits of it and what it can do for you. But also critically being able to evaluate the pitfalls of it and needing to critically, like you said, assess things that are human behaviors, because it isn't a replica for a human.
No.
Humans have to sit behind it and plug it with the correct data in order to enable the right decision making that comes out of it. But I think, and what worries me is because technology is moving at the rapid velocity that it is, all of that becomes yesterday's problem, and there's something new that adds to the equation. And when younger people or even older people, when people are accessing things like ChatGPT or going through, like you mentioned before, job applications and that example of the medical school example in 1988, that's something, that bias is going to show up in those algorithms, and people aren't adeptly or acutely aware of how to deal with that. And if they are, it's like trying to work, just taking it as gold that it's there. You can't do anything about it. Those biases exist. And how to work the system or cheat the system. And if we have a heavier reliance on those machine learning out, just completely not even getting rid of our ability to critically evaluate things, but relying on day-to-day tasks it becomes a really dangerous situation where it's almost like you're just plugged into the matrix and waiting for people to,
it's like Lord of the Rings, the
Yes,
Ring of Power, like
literally.
it's sitting next to you, it's bad, and you know that you need to, like, you shouldn't put it too often on your ring.
Yeah,
right,
because
on your ring finger.
by the way, my favorite movies of all time.
Absolutely,
Just
amazing.
we're going to do this on a different podcast, but they're just the best movies. Great analogy on it though.
It's the charisma, right, and the peer pressure as well. Like, you feel like your peers and your colleagues are using it and they're advancing and they're seemingly much more productive, and you're like, do you know what, I'm gonna keep that window open. Right, I'm gonna ask. I've got 5 questions a day that I can ask for free. Let me go and I don't feel like thinking today. I mean, you do it today and you do it for a month and you do it for a year, and then suddenly you have completely paralyzed yourself in terms of how to autonomously make a decision.
Correct. I mean, I guess when we talk about what can we do to circumvent this, because you already said earlier, which I completely agree with, that just talking about it's not enough. There has to be action. And with everything, with every movement, diversity, equity, and inclusion wasn't something that people really, really thought about in any grand way, I would say, until the last 5 to 10 years, maybe maximum. But when we talk about diversifying the AI field itself, what are your thoughts and feelings on, in order to not have something biased in a particular way, it's important to have diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds, etc.
Definitely there are some measures which we can put in place. Now, again, because of the pace that AI is moving, first of all, any regulations and policies, it is my pessimistic view that usually takes years for them to be embedded into legislation, to be put in place, which basically means that they're gonna end up being a little outdated by the time that they are put in place. Any measures that we put might end up being more diagnostical. We realize that this AI that's been going on for years actually is subject to bias rather than preventative. But let's not be so pessimistic. There are a bunch of things which we can do. All of them require people, which is the irony, right? So we need people. That role is crucial. The first one is a main principle. It's like a dogmatic, axiomatic principle in machine learning and data science, which is use diverse and representative data. Like, if you're going to be doing any statistical analysis that aims to make inferences about the wider population, make sure that your data actually represents correctly that population. Now, we need to be thinking about this problem from the lens of diversity and bias and inclusion, right? So we have to be very stern whenever we identify any traces of sampling bias, of temporal bias, of any outliers and edge cases. That's the first thing, using the right data. If the data is biased, the bias will inadvertently be encoded in the model. The second thing which we can do is, again, a main principle in any machine learning workflow, which is monitoring the performance of the model. Not necessarily talking about the performance in terms of how accurate the model is. We need to monitor the performance of the deployed model in terms of whether it exhibits that behavioral traces of bias and discrimination. The moment you spot something, just immediately address it. It's very cool to have, one option is to have an AI ethicist within your development team who is there to identify and to mitigate those things early on within any project. Explainability of AI. That's something that, and you mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, it is a black box, right? And artificial intelligence is by design extremely, when we go into large language models and deep learning and neural networks and whatnot, very complicated algorithms. We can try, at least, I think, out of integrity, at least try to build machine learning models which are just a little bit more explainable, so that the users can at least partially understand how the decisions are made. Correct. Because currently we're just speculating. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, right? And you come to, it's part of our kind of human nature. When you don't know anything, you try to rationalize it and kind of, explain it to yourself, and then you accept it as the ground truth, which is not usually the case.
True.
The most important measure for me, and I'm a big advocate, and no one can really talk me out of it, is diversity within team composition. And I think that's a universal measure that should be applied by any business with or without AI involved in it. No one can convince me that you can have a homogeneous team with diverse thoughts and diverse approaches. When it comes to catching biases that have been overlooked, you need people from different backgrounds with different experiences who have different sensitivity to different biases. And of course, ethical guidelines, going back to the the important realization that we can't expect people to act out of good faith. You just can't. It's too big of a risk. The stakes are too high to expect people to be smart enough and responsible enough to the society they live in to be doing the right stuff. You need to have policies and legislations, and again, the AI ethicist in place. Those are the little things which we can do. All of those techniques are very easy to implement, but you need to have integrity as a business. And you need to be very stern in your position, and you need people.
Yeah, I honestly, again, could not have summarized that better to me. And I think that the point you raised about everyone's got busy daily lives, the rapid velocity at which life moves, where you've got family, work, different commitments. I don't think people understand the implications of not knowing what sits behind certain things. We so frequently just go through Instagram and forget that the algorithms are picking up our behaviors. We so and creating bias in our everyday activity, whether it's social media, whether it's LinkedIn posts and what you're seeing. And it's really important to understand that if you have that control, and if you critically assess, I think is the theme, if you use your own knowledge and background of what you think is right and wrong, you can curtail some of this. But where you just blindly trust because it's the easier thing to do, like you said, the stakes are too high for it to not necessarily go towards a really dark side. But you and I talked about some of the real pitfalls of AI.
And there's so many more. And if you actually allow me to mention a couple, because I think, obviously hiring processes and facial recognition. And you mentioned already your situation at the airport.
Yes.
There was a humiliating example of a graduate student at MIT who was forced to wear a white face mask every time she had to go into a building to be recognized by the software recognizing the faces, so she can work on her project. There are so many domains that have potentially catastrophic consequences if they're overlooked. One that is very close to my heart is education, for instance, purely because I'm an associate principal, and the bread and butter of my daily responsibility is educating and helping our consultants and guiding them through their first steps. As AI and obviously access to the latest AI becomes paid as an offering, and obviously it requires at least some minimal level of computer literacy, of even having a computer, right, and internet and access to those digital platforms. If we start integrating, because of that peer pressure, let's integrate AI in our educational system, that can lead to such amplification of already existing inequalities in terms of educational access, learning outcomes for communities, for whole countries, even, if you will. Another domain is child welfare services, right? If you use a biased AI within a child protection services, you might target low income and minority families disproportionately, right? And you mentioned it as well, social media algorithms, right? But in that day and age of TikTok and Instagram, and if we use AI, which is biased, it can amplify that divisive and discriminatory content, and it can lead to not just online harassment. We're talking about polarization of people's opinions and seeing those extremes. And I think that's already kind of happened in the past, and we've observed it in different countries.
Right.
And it's really scary, and a lot of public and very kind of influential figures have already taken the stance of, we need to tame our curiosity with some caution here. I don't know how many of them have actually
Followed
reached because a lot of the people taking those decisions, right, we're talking about governments and political figures, obviously that's not their main field domain of working. So it's all boiling down to the understanding that this is an extremely important topic. we should never allow ourselves to underestimate that.
Absolutely. And I think in the industry that we're both in, people have a tendency to want to be almost first adopters.
Yeah.
Like that's the name of the game. What's
Yeah.
your business differentiator? What's
Yeah.
your proposition? How far ahead of the curve are you? But exercising some caution and being able to step back and critically evaluate what are the good elements of this that we can harness to create easier processes in our business, free up some time, free up some bandwidth, versus what are we blindly trusting without knowing and feeding into these biases that are just perpetuated across, for example, the Amazon example that you gave me. Like all of these sorts of avenues haven't been deeply enough explored and widely enough spoken about for people to have that understanding of, okay, if I incorporate this into my everyday life, there are some good elements to it, but there are also several scary and unknown elements, which is the main point, right?
Do you know what? It's a typical thing in economics. When I studied economics, usually there is that balance and equilibrium between if something good happens in the long run, it is bad in the short run, right? And the other way around. It's exactly that, right? Like in the short run, you're gonna benefit massively if you use ChatGPT, for instance, or anything, because it's gonna take away a couple of days of mundane admin work for you. In the long run, however, that will come with some consequences. Are you thinking about them? Are you, thinking about the next generations? How are you going to, how are you going to educate your kids and your grandchildren? Do you want them to not be able to express, their own thoughts and to, what happens when there is, Wi-Fi is down?
Oh my God.
What happens?
I have nieces and nephews who are similar to that. When the Wi-Fi's down and there's no iPad access, it's insane, the reliance on that. And I think that's what you were getting towards before as well, and you spoke about it so brilliantly, is the reliance piece. And when children are still so impressionable and they're soaking up everything like a sponge, the way the world is moving, I'm struggling I'm really struggling to keep up with the understanding around it. And you've got such a wonderful perspective on it because you've had so many years in the industry.
I'm very scared. It's not a wonderful perspective.
I know, but that's almost something that you have that lens of understanding. And I think that many people bury their heads in the sand because we're in this culture of early adopters, new technology coming out. The Apple Vision headset just came out the other week and people were queuing. It's that type of era and lifestyle that we're in, that we question later, but we do it first so that we can be ahead of the curve. And I think it's the critically evaluating those pieces. Do they feed into the biases? Do they actually have a hindrance for our own community, whether it's women, whether it's marginalized communities? Let's step back a second and actually evaluate what it's doing in the long run, right? And I guess finally, I mean, I could honestly talk to you about this all day. It's really, 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 I'm going to pick this up with you offline because I've got so many more thoughts. But I guess any final thoughts or points to consider, especially around the bias element of AI? I know you've referenced a lot of points that we can do as organizations and as people to be more aware and also to take the steps to make it safer. But are you somewhat also positive about the future of AI, or do you take a largely negative view of the future of it based on where we are today?
I have no concerns about the future of AI because it's very bright with or without us liking it or approving of it. Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic about our future in a world where AI will definitely dominate more and more our lives. A lot of people in my circle already know that I'm putting the brakes on artificial intelligence, and I think that's the healthiest thing you can do. Just forget a little bit about that FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. Forget about, I need to jump on the latest trend, because that's actually just harming us. And it's creating that dependency. We won't be able to get rid of it for decades otherwise. I think final kind of, points, I like to regularly remind myself what my personal unique definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, and all of those, philosophical, fundamental pillars of our society are. Just to remind myself that I am a human and this is what I stand up for, right? That's part of my integrity. And for me, the definition of all of those virtues is, it reflects the idea that anyone, regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity, beliefs, they should be treated with the same dignity and respect and opportunity. And if we remind ourselves what actually makes us human and think about, that we're the only ones that actually understand the world the way we see it, and we are the only ones that appreciate the pillars of our society. If you want to observe those pillars within artificial intelligence, remember it's a machine. Okay, it can be used for great stuff, and it can be the salvation, and it can be the demise to everything. And if you want to observe and police those principles, the role of the people is virtually irreplaceable. So honing on to those fundamental principles, learn, read, be critical, reflect, develop that metacognition that you have about, okay, let me sit down and just sit with what I've learned and try to come up with my own standpoint about a certain topic. In the context of, our consultants, we're obviously delivering training in AI ethics to them. And then we're trying to deeply intertwine that as a narrative throughout every part of our training, just to nurture that discussion and foster that understanding. It's not a right or wrong answer. I'm not against AI. And data science and machine learning, otherwise I'll be unemployed. But what I mean is just be able to, it's a philosophical matter, right? And the topic of AI ethics is bound, that's for certain, that's for a fact, it's bound to kind of expand beyond diversity and bias and discrimination. I think in the future we're going to be talking about wider topics such as consciousness and mind, control and autonomy. Who is responsible? Is it the human that developed the AI? Is it the AI itself? If something goes bad, the psychological, the emotional impact AI is going to have on human beings. We are already kind of seeing, the phone and computer is an extension to us, right? So it's going to become very, very interesting, and I really hope that everyone will start reading a little bit more and just and pushing that narrative and agenda. It's time for us to be a little more responsible, and step away from, not everything needs to be trendy. We need to be adults.
I love that. And do you know what? I actually want to end on that, because I think that's a really great piece of advice. It's simple to do. It's to take a step back, but it's actually, I think, going to be hard for a lot of people to reverse the process of just pushing forward. And I think there's a really huge lesson in it. I've certainly learned so much just listening to you. Honestly, it's wonderful. I do a lot of reading around the subject, but because there's so much content out there and you don't really have these, or I have a very unique, wonderful opportunity to have face-to-face conversations with people where you get the most out of it, because you're sharing ideologies, you're sharing ideas, but the fundamental principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, like you mentioned, and the biases all stem from being human. And it's about how to harness those powers in order to drive the technology, rather than having that reliance on the technology and replacing all the human instincts that you have, that you're born with. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us on such an insightful journey. Miri, you are wonderful. I cannot tell you, I've had such a wonderful discussion with you today. And if so firstly, Miri, where can people connect with you? I think that's important if anyone wants to reach out to find out more.
Absolutely. LinkedIn probably is the best place. Mirela Gyurova. Good luck typing that one out. Maybe we can
we'll add a little link there.
And for anyone from our consultants, they already know me probably. So feel free to reach out, and I'm always open for conversations and debates. And remember, even if you're not working in artificial intelligence, this is a philosophical matter, right? Any person that has a unique opinion is equally capable and has the right to talk about those topics.
Absolutely. And I think we're doing something on this podcast and in this new series that we've never done before, which is opening up to everyone who's listening and saying that if you've got a story to tell yourself, whether you're internal Kubrick or external, please do get in touch. We would really love to hear from you, and I would love to interview some people just as amazing of a perspective as you have, Miri, on a myriad of different topics. So we have a dedicated email address now, which is diversity@kubrickgroup.com. Please, send us your stories. We're really interested in amplifying these voices, amplifying different topics of conversations, and providing different critical ways of evaluating things that really tie into how we as a society can get behind diversity, equity, inclusion, and reduce the biases that we're, wherever we can. So Miri, thank you again. Thanks so
much for having me.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you on the next episode.